In a huge, sparkling mansion that seemed like it belonged in a fairy tale, lived a billionaire and his wife, along with their 4 children, quadruplets who had been born just a few years ago. The house was full of luxury. Golden chandeliers hung from the ceilings, crystal-clear fountains sparkled in the gardens, and every room was decorated with the finest furniture money could buy. Servants walked silently through the halls, doing their duties with precision, and yet, despite all the wealth and splendor, there was a sadness that money could not fix. The quadruplets, 2 boys and 2 girls, lived in a world of silence. From the moment they were born, they had never spoken a single word. Doctors had tried everything, specialists had been called, and countless therapies were attempted, but nothing seemed to work. The children communicated only through gestures, expressions, and the occasional cry of frustration or laughter. The parents, both successful and busy with their careers, had everything they could ever want, yet the silence of their children left a deep emptiness in their hearts. They spent nights worrying, wondering if their children would ever be able to speak, to tell them how they felt, or to laugh with words instead of just smiles. They hired the best doctors from around the world, brought in speech therapists, and even consulted psychologists, but no one could give them the answer they so desperately wanted. Each day felt like a repetition of the last, filled with a quiet, fragile routine that made the mansion feel less like a home and more like a place frozen in time. The quadruplets, despite their inability to speak, were full of personality. Each child had their own quirks and little ways of showing what they felt. One boy had a mischievous sparkle in his eyes and loved to play with small toys, arranging them in perfect lines. The other boy preferred drawing and would spend hours scribbling shapes and colors, his hands moving faster than anyone could follow. One girl loved animals and would spend her time gently caring for the family pets, her soft touch showing a tenderness beyond her years. The other girl was more adventurous, climbing small trees in the garden or exploring every corner of the mansion, curious about the world she couldn't yet fully describe. They laughed, cried, and expressed emotions in ways that didn't need words, but still, something was missing. Life in the mansion was quiet in more ways than one. The children's silence seemed to echo in the long hallways, bouncing off the walls decorated with expensive paintings. Family dinners were often solemn, with the parents trying their best to speak to the children, asking questions and waiting for responses that never came in words. The children would smile or shake their heads, and sometimes, they would look at each other and exchange glances that seemed to say more than any word could. The house was alive with activity, yet a certain stillness hung in the air, as if everyone was holding their breath, hoping that one day, something would change. The parents, while loving and caring, sometimes felt helpless. They could buy anything, travel anywhere, and provide the children with every opportunity imaginable, yet their wealth could not solve this problem. They began to realize that money could create comfort, security, and even happiness in small ways, but it could not teach their children to speak, to express themselves fully, or to connect in the way they so desperately wanted. Friends and family would often visit, marveling at the children's beauty and intelligence, but the silence made these visits feel strange, almost unreal. People would talk, laugh, and ask questions, only to be met with gestures or shy smiles, and the quietness of the house would always bring them back to reality. Despite all the challenges, there was one thing the children had that no amount of wealth could buy: innocence and a natural way of seeing the world. They played together, explored their surroundings, and created their own little universe inside the mansion. Their parents watched with a mixture of pride and sadness, loving them deeply but wishing they could hear their voices. Each day was a delicate balance of routine and hope, with moments of laughter, small triumphs, and tiny breakthroughs that hinted at a miracle waiting to happen. The mansion, with all its grandeur, seemed almost like a cage at times. It was beautiful and safe, but it could not fill the silence that weighed on everyone's hearts. The children's inability to speak was more than just a challenge, it was a reminder that life does not always follow the rules of wealth or privilege. The parents began to understand that real change would not come from doctors, specialists, or money alone, it would come from love, patience, and perhaps, someone they had not yet met, someone who could see the children not as fragile beings in need of treatment, but as little souls waiting to be understood. And so, life continued in the mansion, each day blending into the next. The children's silent world existed alongside the parents' quiet hope, and everyone waited for the moment that could turn their lives upside down, a moment that would bring sound, laughter, and life back into the grand halls that had known only silence for too long. Life in the mansion had settled into its quiet rhythm, each day blending into the next, until the day a new person arrived, someone no one expected would change everything. Her name was Clara, a young maid from a humble village far from the glittering city. She came to the mansion with nothing but a small suitcase, worn shoes, and a heart full of hope. Clara had grown up in a simple home, where love and kindness were more valuable than wealth, and she carried that warmth with her everywhere she went. She did not know that her life was about to intersect with 4 children who had lived in silence all their lives, but that intersection would spark something extraordinary. From the moment Clara stepped into the mansion, there was something different about her. Unlike the other staff, who moved quickly and quietly through the halls, focused on rules and routines, Clara moved with curiosity. She looked at the grand chandeliers, the sparkling floors, and the golden furniture, but she didn't seem overwhelmed or impressed. Her eyes were drawn instead to the children, for little faces peeking shyly from the safety of their playroom. They had noticed her too, of course, but instead of fear or suspicion, there was something like quiet curiosity in their eyes. The parents, eager for anything that might help, introduced Clara to the quadruplets. She knelt down on the floor, smiling gently, and whispered soft words, though she knew they might not understand them. "Hello, my little friends," she said. "I'm here to spend time with you. Can we be friends?" The children stared at her, silent, but not frightened. They had grown used to adults who tried to fix them, who treated them like delicate objects rather than children. Clara, however, seemed different. She didn't look at them with pity or expectation. She simply looked at them with interest and warmth, as if saying, "I see you, and I care about you just as you are." At first, the children were hesitant. They didn't approach her or reach out. Instead, they observed, testing this newcomer in their own quiet way. Clara didn't force them to respond. She sat on the floor, played with toys, and read stories aloud, letting the sound of her voice fill the room without demanding anything in return. She laughed with them, whispered silly songs, and clapped whenever they made even the smallest gesture of engagement. Slowly, very slowly, the children began to notice her presence not as a threat or a stranger, but as something comforting. Clara had a secret strength, one that would soon begin to unravel the silence. She believed that children were capable of far more than anyone gave them credit for, especially children who had been underestimated for their differences. She knew that love, patience, and creativity could achieve what therapy alone could not. She began to study the children carefully, learning their gestures, their expressions, the way their eyes lit up when they were happy, and the subtle signs of frustration or curiosity. It was as if she were learning a language that had no words, a language of hearts and minds that the rest of the world had overlooked. The first real connection happened in a simple, unexpected way. One of the boys dropped a small toy car, and instead of immediately picking it up for him like the other staff would, Clara waited. She smiled gently and looked at him, saying nothing, letting him decide. Slowly, cautiously, he reached for it, and when his fingers touched the car, he looked up at her. Clara clapped softly and whispered, "Good job." The boy's eyes sparkled in a way they hadn't before, a small but powerful sign that he was beginning to trust her. Over the next few days, Clara's presence transformed the atmosphere of the mansion. The children began to play more openly, laughing quietly and interacting with her in tiny ways. They experimented with sounds, making soft noises that were closer to speech than ever before. They touched her hands, held her fingers, and followed her movements with curiosity. The parents watched in amazement from a distance, realizing that something miraculous was beginning, not because of medicine or money, but because of one person's heart and patience. Clara's arrival was not just the beginning of a new routine, it was the spark that would ignite the children's world, bringing color, warmth, and life into a house that had known only silence. In those first days, she showed that connection could not be bought, that true understanding comes from seeing a person fully and meeting them where they are. Little did anyone know, the quiet maid from a faraway village would become the key to unlocking the voices of the quadruplets, changing their lives, and the lives of everyone in the mansion, forever. The first days of Clara's arrival had passed, and slowly, a quiet change began to settle over the mansion. The quadruplets were still silent, but something in their eyes had shifted. Instead of staring at her cautiously, they watched her with a new curiosity, as if wondering what this strange but gentle presence would do next. Clara knew she could not force them to speak or act. Trust was delicate, and it had to grow naturally, like a small seed nurtured by patience and care. She had learned that the children's silence was not just a challenge, it was their world, their protection. To truly reach them, she had to respect that world and gently step inside, piece by piece. Each morning, Clara would enter the playroom with a bright smile and a quiet energy that seemed to ripple through the air. She would sit on the floor and arrange the children's toys, not in perfection, but in a way that invited them to explore. She brought puzzles, blocks, and colors, and most importantly, she brought her attention. She watched every small movement, every glance, every gesture, celebrating tiny accomplishments that adults might overlook. A toy stacked, a hand held out, a look of delight, all of these were victories in their silent world. At first, the children did not speak or respond verbally, but they began to imitate her actions. One girl reached for a toy after watching Clara do it. One boy copied the way she clapped her hands when she was happy. Clara would smile and praise them softly, not with loud words, but with warmth that felt like sunlight. "I see you," she whispered. "I see how smart and brave you are." The children seemed to understand, their eyes lighting up in ways no one had seen before. It was as if her voice carried meaning even without words, and slowly, the walls around their silence began to soften. Clara also discovered that each child had a unique way of learning and connecting. One boy loved movement and rhythm, so she would sing softly and tap out patterns on the floor for him to follow. The other boy responded best to drawing, so she brought paper and crayons and joined him in creating colorful shapes, letting him take the lead. The adventurous girl wanted to explore, so Clara turned ordinary objects into games of discovery, letting her climb, touch, and investigate safely. The gentle girl, who loved animals, was drawn to Clara's quiet, patient care, and soon they would spend hours brushing the pets together, whispering soft words the animals seemed to understand. Clara was not trying to force them into speech, she was giving them a language of trust, one that was felt in the heart rather than spoken aloud. The breakthrough moments were small, almost imperceptible, but they were powerful. One afternoon, the children were playing quietly when the eldest boy, without thinking, reached out and took Clara's hand. She looked at him with surprise and joy. "Yes," she whispered softly. "You can do it." That touch, that simple gesture, was more than connection, it was trust. From that day on, the children began seeking her out more often, testing the limits of their comfort and seeing how far this new relationship could go. They started to experiment with soft sounds, vowels at first, then small consonants, careful, cautious, like stepping onto ice that might crack under them. Clara would clap quietly, smile, and never push too hard. She celebrated every tiny success, understanding that building trust required patience more than pressure. Even the parents noticed the change. They watched from a distance as Clara moved among the children, her presence like a gentle current that drew them closer. They realized that no matter how much money or care they could provide, it was Clara's unique ability to see the children as individuals, to respect their silence while encouraging exploration, that was truly working. They began to understand that trust could not be bought, only nurtured. By the end of the third week, the quadruplets were showing clear signs of connection. They laughed softly in response to Clara's playful antics, shared glances that seemed like inside jokes, and even began following simple instructions she gave without needing gestures from the parents. The house, once heavy with silence, was beginning to feel alive in a new way. The walls seemed warmer, the air lighter, as if the children's trust had brought life back into the mansion. Clara understood that this was only the beginning. Building trust was not a single moment, it was a journey, a slow unfolding of courage and understanding. But the first cracks in the wall of silence had appeared, and she knew, deep in her heart, that once the children learned to trust her completely, there would be no turning back. The laughter, the soft words, and the bond they were forming were the first steps toward a miracle that no one in the mansion could have imagined. And so, each day, Clara continued her gentle work, patient and kind, building bridges of trust in a house that had long known only silence, unaware that the quiet moments she created were laying the foundation for voices that would one day fill every corner of the mansion. Days turned into weeks, and Clara's gentle presence in the mansion began to bring subtle changes. The quadruplets, once so silent and withdrawn, had started responding to her in ways no one had thought possible. But Clara knew that patience alone would not be enough. They needed more than kindness, they needed a spark, something unexpected that could reach deep into their hearts and awaken a new world for them. She had a feeling that if she could find the right way to connect, even their silence could be broken. It was one afternoon, quiet and warm, that the first unexpected connection happened. Clara had brought a small music box with her, something she had found in her village, a simple, hand-cranked toy that played a soft, lilting melody. She wound it carefully and let the gentle notes drift across the playroom. The children paused in their play, their eyes drawn to the delicate sounds. For the first time, they were captivated by something that was not a toy or a gesture but a voice they could feel in their ears and hearts. The music was soft, inviting, and it seemed to speak a language they understood without words. Clara noticed how their eyes followed every movement of the music box, how their tiny hands reached toward it hesitantly, as if drawn by some invisible thread. She didn't rush them. She simply smiled and let the music play, occasionally clapping softly to the rhythm, encouraging them without pushing. Then something remarkable happened. One of the boys, the mischievous eldest, began to hum along, a tiny, uncertain sound that had never come from him before. His lips moved slightly, his eyes wide with surprise at the sound he had created. Clara's heart leapt. She clapped quietly and whispered, "Yes. You're amazing." The other children were watching closely. The sound, simple as it was, seemed to awaken something in them too. Slowly, one by one, they began experimenting with their own voices. Soft vowels, gentle hums, and tiny consonants floated in the room, a magical symphony of first attempts at speech. Clara encouraged each sound with patience, her eyes shining with pride. She knew this was a breakthrough, not forced, but discovered, a bridge between their silent world and the one full of words, laughter, and connection. But music was only the beginning. Clara discovered that each child responded differently to sounds and rhythm. The youngest girl, shy and delicate, loved to mimic the patterns of the music, tapping her tiny fingers on the floor to match Clara's gentle claps. The adventurous girl moved her whole body, dancing to the melody, discovering joy in movement that complemented sound. One of the boys tried singing along with the tunes, experimenting with pitch and tone, while the other used the music as inspiration for drawing, humming quietly as he created shapes and colors on paper. Each child had their own path, and Clara learned to follow it, guiding them without ever demanding. The parents, watching from the edge of the playroom, could hardly believe their eyes. The silence that had filled the mansion for years was finally breaking, not through force or medicine, but through something so simple, so human, connection through creativity and understanding. Clara's approach had been unconventional, but it worked. The children were beginning to communicate in ways they had never done before, discovering that their voices, though fragile, could exist in the world. Even more remarkable was how the children began to connect with each other. They started experimenting with shared sounds, giggling at the noises they could make together. Their gestures became more expressive, paired with hums, squeaks, and whispers that were slowly turning into recognizable words. Clara had given them a safe space to explore, to make mistakes, and to discover joy in expressing themselves. For the first time, their world was expanding beyond gestures and silence. It was alive with sound, emotion, and laughter. By the end of that afternoon, something magical had taken place. The children's eyes sparkled with curiosity and excitement, their tiny voices mingling with the soft music, creating a melody that no one in the mansion would ever forget. Clara realized that this unexpected connection, through music, patience, and love, was the key to unlocking the children's silence. What had seemed impossible was now within reach, and she could feel, deep in her heart, that the greatest breakthroughs were yet to come. From that day on, the mansion was never quite the same. Even in the quiet moments, one could hear soft hums, whispered words, and the beginnings of laughter. The silence was no longer oppressive, it was a canvas waiting to be filled, and Clara had given the children the first brushstrokes. The unexpected connection she had discovered through music had opened a door to voices, to joy, and to a future none of them had imagined, and for the first time, everyone believed that miracles were truly possible. After weeks of patient care and creative exploration, the mansion began to feel different. The quadruplets, once so silent, were now slowly discovering a world of sounds and gestures that went beyond mere imitation. Clara had sparked something within them, a curiosity, a willingness, and most importantly, a trust that encouraged them to try things they had never dared before. It was in these small moments that miracles began to appear, almost unnoticed, but powerful enough to change everything. It started with the littlest things. One morning, Clara was sitting on the playroom floor, tapping a small drum in rhythm. She noticed that one of the boys, who had always been cautious and quiet, picked up a spoon from a nearby tray and tapped it lightly, matching her rhythm. It wasn't perfect, but it was the first deliberate sound he had made on his own. Clara's eyes sparkled. She whispered, "That's wonderful. You did it," and clapped softly. The boy's eyes widened in surprise, and then a small smile spread across his face. For him, it was a triumph. For Clara, it was a sign that trust and encouragement were working in ways no one else had imagined. The other children began following suit. The adventurous girl discovered a love for simple songs, humming softly as she moved around the room. The youngest girl, who had always been shy, started making small vowel sounds while brushing the family cat, a tiny voice paired with the tender affection she showed the animal. And the second boy, who loved drawing, began to hum quietly as he sketched shapes on paper, combining sound and creativity in a way that brought him joy. Each sound, each small attempt at communication, was celebrated, not with pressure, but with warmth, praise, and encouragement. Clara noticed another remarkable change: the children were beginning to interact with each other more naturally. They experimented with sounds together, laughing when one made a funny noise and copying each other's hums. They shared toys and games without needing Clara to guide every step, creating little moments of connection that had never existed before. The mansion, once so quiet, was now filled with soft sounds, giggles, and whispers. Every small miracle was like a thread weaving the children together, strengthening their bond and slowly bringing life back into the grand halls. The parents could hardly believe the transformation. They watched as their children experimented with sounds, made gestures that seemed almost like words, and even whispered small syllables to each other. They realized that the most valuable lessons could not be bought. Patience, creativity, and love were the keys to unlocking their children's potential. Clara had given the children something no amount of wealth could: confidence in themselves, the freedom to explore, and the safety to make mistakes. Even the servants noticed the changes. The mansion felt warmer, lighter, almost as if it had been waiting for these small miracles to arrive. The laughter, the soft sounds, and the growing interactions between the children gave the house a new rhythm. Clara's approach had been simple yet profound. She celebrated each tiny success, encouraged curiosity, and allowed the children to discover their voices in their own way. One day, a particularly magical moment occurred. The eldest boy, inspired by the music and rhythm Clara had introduced weeks ago, attempted his first word, not perfectly, but audibly. "Mama," he whispered, looking up at his mother with wide, hopeful eyes. She froze, tears welling in her eyes, as she bent down to hug him tightly. The other children watched, fascinated, and then began experimenting with their own sounds, trying to repeat what they had just heard. It was a chain reaction of small victories, each one more astonishing than the last. Clara stood to the side, smiling quietly, feeling a deep sense of fulfillment. She knew this was just the beginning. These small miracles, sounds, gestures, laughter, and tiny words, were the building blocks of something far greater. The children were discovering not only how to communicate but also how to express themselves, connect with each other, and feel joy in ways that had been impossible before. The mansion, once filled with silence, was now alive with hope. Each day brought new sounds, new laughter, and new signs of progress. Clara had shown that miracles often start small, a tap of a spoon, a soft hum, a whispered word. Yet these small miracles had the power to change everything, and for the first time, everyone in the mansion truly believed that the silence that had defined the children's lives was finally beginning to break. The mansion had changed in ways no one could have imagined. Once a place of silence, it now hummed with the soft sounds of discovery, laughter, and tentative words. But nothing could have prepared the parents, or Clara, for what was about to happen. The transformation of the quadruplets was no longer gradual, it was about to reach a moment so extraordinary that it would leave everyone breathless. It started on a rainy afternoon, the kind of day that made the grand halls of the mansion feel cozy and still. Clara had gathered the children in the playroom, bringing out a basket of small percussion instruments, drums, tambourines, and bells. She encouraged them to play freely, to explore sounds without worrying about mistakes. The children, now accustomed to her patience and warmth, eagerly joined in, their tiny hands tapping, shaking, and striking instruments. But this time, something was different. As the eldest boy drummed a steady rhythm, the youngest girl picked up a tambourine and added her own beat. The other two children, inspired by the sound, began clapping and humming along. Then, almost imperceptibly at first, the eldest boy opened his mouth and said a clear word, yes. It was not just a sound or a random noise, it was a word spoken with intention, pride, and excitement. Clara froze for a moment, unsure if she had imagined it, but the boy's eyes sparkled, confirming that it had truly happened. The room erupted, not with loud shouting, but with a different kind of energy. The second boy, who had been drumming beside him, tried to mimic the word, producing a slightly different version, yes. The adventurous girl giggled and whispered her own tiny word, go, while the youngest girl, shy but determined, managed a soft, hi. Each word was imperfect, but each word was real, and it sent waves of shock and joy through everyone present. The parents, who had been watching quietly from the doorway, could hardly believe their eyes. Tears streamed down the mother's face as she rushed forward to embrace her eldest son. The father, normally reserved and composed, laughed and cried at the same time, overwhelmed by the miracle unfolding before him. The quadruplets, who had spent years in silence, were now speaking, really speaking, for the first time in their lives. Clara, though overjoyed, remained calm. She understood the magnitude of this moment. It was not the result of pressure, doctors, or wealth, it was the result of trust, patience, and genuine connection. She had given the children the space to explore, the courage to try, and the confidence to believe that their voices mattered. And now, in this unexpected symphony of first words, all that care had come to life. The transformation did not stop there. Once the initial words were spoken, the children seemed to discover a hidden power within themselves. Words flowed more easily, sometimes simple, mama, papa, play, sometimes more expressive, happy, look, fun. Their gestures, once the only way to communicate, were now paired with sound, amplifying their expressions and connecting them to the world in a way that had been unimaginable before. Laughter, excitement, and even gentle arguments filled the playroom, transforming it from a space of caution into one of vibrant life. Neighbors, friends, and staff who had once marveled at the children's silence were now astonished by the change. They had expected slow progress, small steps, perhaps a sound here or there. But this was a breakthrough that went beyond imagination. The children, once voiceless, were now active participants in their own lives, exploring language, sharing feelings, and even teasing each other in playful ways. In that moment, the parents realized something profound: the greatest miracles do not come from money, status, or even expert knowledge. They come from love, patience, and the courage to meet others where they are. Clara, the humble maid from a distant village, had unlocked what no one else could, not through force, but through understanding. Her gentle guidance had turned the impossible into reality. That evening, as the rain tapped softly on the windows, the mansion felt alive in a way it never had before. The silence that had once defined it was gone, replaced by voices, laughter, and a joy that filled every corner. The quadruplets were no longer just children, they were individuals discovering their own power, their own voice, and their own ability to connect with the world. And all of it had begun with one unexpected, patient, and unwavering act of love. The mansion had changed in ways the billionaire and his wife had never imagined. For years, their children had lived in silence, and they had felt helpless despite all the wealth in the world. Doctors, specialists, and the finest therapists had tried and failed to break through the wall of quiet that surrounded the quadruplets. But now, after weeks of Clara's gentle care, patience, and unexpected methods, the children were speaking. Their laughter, soft words, and playful sounds filled the house, transforming every room into a place of warmth and life. It was in this moment of transformation that the parents began to see something they had never understood before. The life they had built for their children, filled with comfort, luxury, and every material desire, was not what had given them a voice. It had been Clara, the humble maid, who had unlocked their hearts. She had no special degree, no wealth, and no influence other than her own patience, creativity, and compassion. And yet, her presence had accomplished what all the resources of the parents could not. The mother, sitting in the playroom one afternoon, watched as the children played together, laughing and speaking in their own imperfect, beautiful words. She realized that her attempts to control every aspect of their lives, to provide perfection and security, had only created distance. The children had lived in silence because they had never been truly seen, not really. But Clara had looked at them and said, without words, "You matter. You are enough as you are." That simple understanding had made all the difference. The father, who had often felt frustrated and powerless, came to a similar realization. He had thought that money could solve everything, that hiring the best professionals and buying the finest toys and gadgets could fill the gaps in his children's lives. But he now understood that wealth could not replace connection, patience, or genuine love. Clara had shown him that real change comes not from force or gifts, but from presence, understanding, and faith in a child's potential. As the days passed, the family began to rethink everything about their life. Dinner conversations became joyful and unhurried, filled with questions and answers, laughter, and even playful teasing. The children began sharing stories in their own words, simple as they were, and the parents listened with rapt attention, realizing that this exchange of thoughts and feelings was far more valuable than any toy, any mansion, or any privilege. The walls that had once echoed with silence now resonated with love, understanding, and family bonds that had been waiting for a breakthrough. It wasn't just about the children's voices, it was about the family itself. The parents realized that they had been living in a world of appearances, believing that success and wealth were enough to ensure happiness. Clara had shown them that the most meaningful impact comes from the simplest acts, listening, encouraging, and believing in someone who cannot yet show their potential. The children's growth had become a mirror for the parents, reflecting back the lessons they themselves had ignored for too long. One quiet evening, the mother pulled Clara aside, tears in her eyes. "You've done what none of us could," she whispered. "You've given our children voices, and you've given us a family again." Clara simply smiled, shaking her head. "They always had the voices," she said gently. "They just needed someone to help them believe they could use them." That realization hit the parents hard. They understood that their children had been waiting for love, attention, and patience, not perfection or possessions. The mansion, grand as it was, had felt empty because it lacked what truly mattered: connection. Clara's arrival had reminded them that sometimes, the smallest gestures, the quietest presence, and the simplest acts of care can create miracles far greater than money or power ever could. The family's transformation was now complete in a new way. The children had discovered their voices, and the parents had discovered humility, gratitude, and a deeper understanding of what it means to be present. They no longer measured success by wealth or appearances, they measured it by love, trust, and the ability to nurture life, creativity, and joy. From that moment on, the mansion was no longer just a house of luxury, it had become a home of understanding, empathy, and genuine happiness. And at the center of it all was Clara, whose quiet strength had changed not only the lives of the quadruplets but also the hearts of the parents, teaching them that true miracles often come from the most unexpected places. The mansion, once filled with silence and quiet tension, had become a place alive with laughter, chatter, and the soft hum of discovery. The quadruplets, who had spent their early years in a world without words, were now speaking, singing, and expressing themselves in ways that filled every room with warmth. The transformation was nothing short of miraculous, but the true wonder was not only in the children's voices, it was in the hearts of everyone around them, especially their parents. Clara, the humble maid from a distant village, had become the heart of the household. She moved through the rooms with quiet grace, encouraging, guiding, and celebrating each tiny word, each soft hum, each new sound the children discovered. The quadruplets adored her, following her lead in games, music, and creative play. They no longer saw her as a stranger or a servant, she was family, the one who had unlocked their voices and, in doing so, had opened a new chapter in all of their lives. The parents had grown in ways they never expected. The billionaire, who had long measured success in wealth and achievements, now understood that life's true riches lay not in possessions, but in connection, empathy, and shared moments of love. The mother, who had worried for years about her children's future, had learned patience, humility, and the quiet power of belief. Together, they watched their children speak, laugh, and play with a depth of emotion they had never thought possible. Every whispered, "Mama," every giggle, every soft word was a reminder that love and understanding could create miracles more powerful than money or influence ever could. The children themselves had changed profoundly. They were no longer limited by silence or fear, their world had expanded. The eldest boy, who had once been cautious and withdrawn, now led games and made jokes that made everyone laugh. The adventurous girl explored every corner of the mansion, pointing out wonders and naming them aloud. The gentle girl, who had been shy and reserved, spoke her thoughts softly but clearly, showing affection for her family and pets alike. And the youngest boy, inspired by Clara's patience, used words, sounds, and gestures together to express himself fully. For the first time, they were free to be themselves, not as muted children, but as vibrant individuals discovering the joy of language and connection. Even the mansion itself seemed transformed. The once still halls now echoed with laughter and conversation. The rooms glowed not only with sunlight reflecting off crystal chandeliers, but with the warmth of a family rediscovering its bond. Servants and staff watched quietly, often smiling at the sight of children and parents talking, laughing, and playing together. It was clear that this home was no longer defined by wealth or luxury, it was defined by love, trust, and the small miracles that had brought the family together. One afternoon, as the sun poured through the grand windows, Clara sat with the children in the garden. They sang songs, laughed at silly rhymes, and spoke words that had once been impossible. The parents joined them, holding hands and listening, realizing that these moments were far more precious than anything money could buy. The family understood that the journey they had been on, the struggles, the silence, the hope, and the unexpected guidance of Clara, had taught them something profound. Life's greatest gifts are often invisible, felt in the heart rather than seen with the eyes. The story of the quadruplets and their transformation spread quietly among friends, neighbors, and even the staff. It became a tale of hope, patience, and the extraordinary power of kindness. Everyone who heard it realized that miracles can happen in the most unexpected ways, often through the simplest acts of love. And for the billionaire and his wife, the lesson was clear: the truest wealth is not in gold or jewels, but in the ability to nurture, understand, and believe in others. As the evening sun set over the mansion, the family gathered together in the living room. The quadruplets, once silent, chattered and laughed, sharing stories of their day, while Clara watched with quiet pride. The parents, holding each other close, smiled, tears of gratitude in their eyes. The house, once a place of silence, was now filled with life, warmth, and hope. And in that moment, everyone understood something simple yet profound: sometimes, the smallest person, with the kindest heart, can change everything. The mansion had become more than a home. It had become a sanctuary of love, growth, and transformation, a place where miracles were possible, where voices could be found, and where hearts could truly connect. And all of it had begun with one humble maid who believed in the power of patience, kindness, and hope. The silence had ended. The laughter had begun. And the story of the quadruplets would forever remind everyone that the most extraordinary changes often come from the most unexpected places.